The first time they told me I was too sensitive for business, I almost believed them. Almost. I was 21 when I stepped into the glass towers of downtown Chicago for my very first internship. For a girl from a small town where the tallest building was a 4-story library, the sheer height of those skyscrapers felt like another planet. The city pulsed with ambition. Men in pressed suits barked into Bluetooth earpieces. Women in heels clicked across marble lobbies without looking back. And every elevator ride felt like stepping into a competition where even silence was a weapon. I thought I was ready for it. I thought my small-town work ethic and eagerness to learn would be enough to prove myself. What I didn't know was how quickly kindness gets mistaken for weakness when profit is the only god people pray to. I had always been the girl who cared too much. In high school, it showed when I stayed late to tutor kids who couldn't keep up. In college, it showed when I volunteered at the counseling center instead of networking at fraternity parties. I was the listener, the fixer, the one who noticed when someone's hands shook before a presentation or when their laughter sounded hollow. I thought that caring would make me good at business, that empathy was a strength. But inside those office walls, empathy was currency no one valued. Inside those conference rooms, the rules were simple. The loudest voice wins. The toughest skin survives, and emotions are liabilities to be crushed. The moment that shattered my illusions happened just 3 weeks into my internship. A fellow intern, Daniel, was unfairly blamed for a mistake in a client file. He hadn't even touched that account, but the senior associate decided he made an easy scapegoat. In front of everyone, Daniel was scolded so harshly he could barely keep his composure. When the meeting ended, I found him in the hallway, his hands trembling as he tried to retie his tie. Something about it broke me. My throat tightened, my chest ached, and before I knew it, tears blurred my vision. I tried to hide them, but one of the analysts saw me, smirked, and whispered just loud enough for others to hear. "She's crying? Over him? God help her when she sees real business." The snickers stung worse than the words. Within a day, whispers floated across the office.
But here's the truth. Sensitivity isn't a faucet you can turn off. It's a flood that runs through every interaction, every decision, every instinct. I couldn't unsee the exhaustion in the interns' eyes when they pulled all-nighters, or the way junior analysts carried invisible bruises from verbal lashings. I couldn't stop noticing when a colleague was set up to fail, or when kindness could have changed everything. And the more I noticed, the more alien I felt in a place that celebrated only aggression. Still, I kept pushing myself. Every morning, I ironed my thrift store blazer, straightened my back, and practiced keeping my face unreadable in the mirror. I thought if I looked tougher, maybe I would be tougher. I thought if I swallowed my reactions, maybe no one would see the storm inside me. I thought silence was survival. But silence is also suffocation, and mine was about to break. It happened in the 15th floor boardroom, during a weekly meeting where interns were allowed to observe. The air smelled of burnt coffee and ambition. A senior partner, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, scanned the room with the confidence of someone who had crushed 100 careers without blinking. He asked for feedback on a recent campaign. My heart pounded because I had ideas, actual ideas I had been working on after hours, scribbled in the margins of my notebook. I raised my hand, hesitated, then spoke. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I outlined a strategy focused on customer trust and authentic engagement. For a brief second, I believed I had broken through the noise. The room was silent, listening. Then the partner leaned back, smirked, and let out a dry laugh. "Cute," he said, "but this isn't about feelings. This is about money. If you want to talk about trust and authenticity, maybe you should stick to HR or social work. Real business eats people alive, and if you're already this sensitive, it'll chew you up and spit you out." The room erupted in laughter, sharp, cruel, echoing off the glass walls. My face burned, my throat closed. But I refused to cry, not here, not now. I forced my gaze to the table, gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. Every second felt like an eternity. Every laugh like a nail hammered into my confidence. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I wanted to vanish. Sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was armor they couldn't understand. Where they saw softness, I saw strategy. Where they saw fragility, I saw focus. Where they saw liability, I saw leadership waiting to be forged in fire. And yet, in that moment, I had no proof, no power, no position. Just a broken reputation, a shattered confidence, and a choice. Walk away and let their words define me, or stay and learn how to turn every scar into a weapon. I didn't know then how far that choice would take me. I didn't know that one day, the very sensitivity they mocked would make me a CEO. All I knew was that I could not and would not let that boardroom laughter be the end of my story. I returned to the office the next morning, still raw from humiliation, only to find a memo waiting on my desk. A memo that would change everything. If business was survival of the fittest, then I was already marked as prey. When I returned to the office after that humiliating meeting, the memo waiting on my desk felt like a cruel joke. It was a congratulatory note. I had been offered a full-time position once my internship ended. On paper, it should have been the validation I craved. In reality, it felt like they weren't hiring me because they saw potential. They were hiring me because they saw someone they could mold, silence, and control. Still, I accepted. Walking away would have meant admitting they were right. I wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction. So, I stepped into my first corporate job with the bruises of my internship still fresh, determined to prove that sensitivity didn't mean weakness. The office I joined was a battlefield disguised as a workplace. The high-rise lobby gleamed with polished marble. The reception smelled faintly of expensive cologne, and everyone walked as if they were sprinting against time itself. But beneath the shine was a suffocating tension, the kind that clung to your skin. People didn't just work there, they survived. Smiles were thin, handshakes tighter than necessary, and every conversation carried the undertone of calculation. I realized quickly that this wasn't a company, it was a shark tank, and the water was red before I even dipped my toes in. My new boss, Richard, was the kind of man. Weeks, his attacks became routine. He dismissed my ideas before I finished presenting them, rolled his eyes when I asked clarifying questions, and once even told me, maybe you should take notes instead of trying to think. His words sliced deeper than he realized, because they didn't just belittle me, they tried to erase me. And when I dared to confront him gently about his tone, he smirked and said, "Don't be so dramatic. You're imagining things. If you want to survive here, grow thicker skin." That was the first time I learned the word that would haunt me for years: gaslighting. He made me doubt my own memory, my own perception of reality. Every time I left his office, I wondered if I was the problem, if maybe I truly was too fragile for this world. But while he thought he was breaking me, I was building something stronger than he could see. I began keeping a journal, a secret record of every insult, every slight, every moment he tried to twist truth into fiction. At first, it was just therapy, a way to keep myself sane when my thoughts spiraled late at night. But slowly it became something else: evidence, a living archive of a toxic culture that fed on silence. I filled page after page with dates, quotes, facial expressions, even the subtle body language of my colleagues when they flinched under his ridicule. My journal wasn't just ink on paper, it was my weapon, even if I didn't yet know how I would use it. As I wrote, I began noticing something powerful. My so-called sensitivity gave me sight where others were blind. I could see the fear in my teammates before they spoke, the hesitation in their voices, the silent calculations they made to avoid Richard's wrath. I could sense when someone was about to be targeted, and I knew how to quietly deflect his attention to protect them without him realizing it. It was as if my empathy, the very thing they mocked, allowed me to read the battlefield more clearly than the so-called warriors. Richard believed he controlled the room, but I could see the cracks in his armor. And once you see cracks,
you can decide how to widen them. Still, nothing prepared me for the moment that would test me the most. It was during a quarterly strategy session, one of those high-stakes meetings where he cleared his throat, leaned forward, and began presenting. My stomach dropped as I heard the words spilling from his mouth. Slide by slide, he outlined my proposal, the market analysis I had spent nights refining, the creative strategy I had fought to align with customer trust, the phrasing I had carefully chosen. It was all mine, but now it was his. The partners nodded, impressed. One leaned back and said, "This is strong work, Richard." Another added, "Exactly the innovation we need." And then, as if to twist the knife, Richard looked across the table at me and said, "This is the kind of thinking I expect from my team. Take notes." The room chuckled. My hands shook under the table. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream, to shout the truth, to stand up and claim what was mine. But I sat there, silent, my throat raw with swallowed rage. I had been erased in real time, and no one cared. That night, I walked home in the biting Chicago wind, the city lights blurring through my tears. I had never felt so small, so humiliated, so voiceless. But beneath the despair was a fire that refused to die. If they thought they could silence me forever, they were wrong. Richard had stolen my idea, but he had also revealed his fear. He knew my ideas had power. And if one stolen proposal could earn him praise, then what would happen when I learned to protect myself? When I learned to fight back on my terms? I didn't know it then, but the very betrayal that shattered me would become the seed of my greatest revenge. And it began the moment I stopped trusting Richard and started plotting my own rise. The day my own idea came back to me with someone else's name on it, I felt invisible. When Richard stood in that boardroom, presenting my work as if it had sprung from his own mind, I sat frozen in silence. Every nod of approval, every word of praise directed toward him felt like another knife sinking deeper into my chest. I remember gripping the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles burned white. I wanted to stand, to shout, to claim my truth, but my voice betrayed me. It stayed trapped inside, screaming in a place no one could hear. That night, when I finally stumbled into my apartment, the weight of the day crushed me. I collapsed onto the floor, and they were mocking me, whispering that I didn't belong in this game. When I finally answered my phone, it was my mother's voice that filled the silence. She asked how I was doing, and without meaning to, I broke down all over again. I confessed everything, the humiliation, the laughter, the theft of my work, the way I felt like a ghost in my own career. She was quiet for a long time before she finally said, "Honey, maybe this isn't your world. Maybe your heart is too good for business." Her words weren't cruel, they were protective. But in that moment, they cut deeper than Richard's insults ever could. If even my own family thought I didn't belong here, then maybe everyone was right. Over the next few days, I leaned on friends too, hoping for comfort. Instead, I got the same chorus. Quit. Save yourself. Find a place where your empathy matters. They meant well, but every piece of advice felt like another shovel of dirt over my grave. I didn't want to be told to leave. I didn't want to run. What I wanted, what I needed, was to prove them all wrong. Because if I walked away, their laughter would echo forever. If I walked away, Richard's theft would be complete. He would not only have stolen my work, he would have stolen my future. Somewhere between grief and fury, a realization settled in. I couldn't play their game by their rules. If I wanted to survive, I had to learn the rules behind the rules. So I began to study, not spreadsheets or market reports, but power itself. Late at night, when the city outside finally slept, I sat at my desk with books scattered around me. Memoirs of CEOs, biographies of political leaders, essays on negotiation and influence. I devoured them like oxygen. I learned that power wasn't just about titles or corner offices. It was about perception, timing, and leverage. It was about knowing when to speak and when silence could slice sharper than words. It was about understanding that every room had invisible currents, and the people who survived were the ones who could read and ride those currents.
But books weren't enough, so I started watching, really watching. In meetings, I stopped fighting to be heard and began observing who got heard and why. I noticed how men like Richard leaned back in their chairs to signal dominance, how they cut off others who had knowledge, but no guidance.
And then she appeared. Her name was Elaine Carter, a senior executive whose reputation stretched across the industry. She was elegant without trying, commanding without raising her voice, and feared not because she barked like Richard, but because she cut with precision. People said Elaine had once been exactly where I was, dismissed, underestimated, told she wasn't ruthless enough. And yet, here she stood, one of the few women who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated empire. The first time Elaine spoke to me, it was almost accidental. After a meeting, while the room buzzed with chatter, she lingered behind and approached my desk. "That was your proposal Richard presented, wasn't it?" Her tone wasn't mocking. It was matter of fact, piercing. I froze, unsure if admitting the truth would cost me even more. But something in her eyes, sharp yet knowing, pulled the words out of me. "Yes," I whispered. She gave the faintest smile, the kind that hid more than it revealed, and said, "Then you're learning the first rule of survival. Protect your ideas, or someone will feed on them." Her acknowledgement shook me. For weeks I had felt invisible, erased, doubting my own worth. And in a single sentence, Elaine saw me. She didn't pat me on the shoulder or tell me to be stronger. She simply confirmed what I already knew, that I was playing in a world designed to strip me bare, and if I didn't learn to fight, I would be buried. From that day I watched her closely, how she walked into a room without rushing, how she spoke less but commanded more, how people seemed to lean toward her as if gravity itself bent in her direction. She was proof that there was a way to survive without becoming Richard. She was proof that leadership could be something different. One afternoon, as I packed my bag, Elaine passed by and paused again. "Do you write things down?" she asked. My heart stopped. Had she discovered my secret journal? I nodded hesitantly. She tilted her head. "Good. Never trust memory in this place. But remember, notes don't protect you. Strategy does." Before I could respond, she was gone, leaving me more shaken than any insult Richard had ever thrown into the office. Not as prey, but as a student of power. I watched every move Richard made, not with fear, but with analysis. I filled my journal not just with injustices, but with patterns, alliances, and leverage points. I began to understand that corporate politics wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And if I could learn the steps, I could stop tripping over their laughter and start directing the dance myself. Still, the fear never left completely. Every day felt like walking a tightrope above a pit of sharks. But now, I had something I didn't before. Guidance. Elaine didn't hover or hold my hand, but every so often she would pass by my desk, drop a single line of advice, and walk away. Each line was a spark, pushing me forward. And then came the moment that sealed it. After another brutal meeting where Richard once again twisted the narrative to his advantage, I lingered behind, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Elaine approached, leaned close so only I could hear, and whispered words that would etch themselves into my bones. "If you don't protect yourself, they'll bury you alive." I was tired of being prey. It was time to learn how predators moved. Elaine's warning stayed with me like an echo I couldn't silence. "If you don't protect yourself, they'll bury you alive." Those words weren't just advice, they were prophecy. And I knew she wasn't exaggerating. Every day in that office was a test, every meeting a battlefield, and every glance a calculation of who was strong enough to stand and who would crumble. For weeks, I replayed her voice in my head until the meaning finally sank in. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't just work hard. I had to learn how power truly worked. Because the rules they wrote down in handbooks weren't the rules that actually ran the boardroom. I began to see the company differently. Meetings were no longer about information sharing. They were performances where status was asserted, territory marked, and influence exchanged in subtle ways. It wasn't about who had the best idea, it was about who spoke first,
who spoke last, who leaned back with practiced ease to signal authority, and who made eye contact just long enough to intimidate. I noticed how Richard never presented alone. He always aligned himself with one part, asking for permission, but claiming space. At first, my hands shook under the table. My throat ached from holding back the urge to blurt out my ideas too soon. But slowly, I discovered the strength in restraint. People listened more when I spoke less, but with intention. I stopped apologizing before presenting, stopped saying just or maybe. I learned that hesitation was blood in the water. Precision, even when uncertain, was armor. At night, I practiced in front of my mirror. Shoulders squared, voice lowered, sentences longer and more deliberate. I wasn't trying to imitate Richard's arrogance. I was building my own version of strength. Where he barked, I learned to cut softly. Where he bulldozed, I learned to redirect. Where he intimidated, I learned to anticipate. My empathy, the very thing they mocked, became my hidden blade. I could sense when Richard was gearing up to interrupt, so I preempted him with a pause that forced the room's attention on me. I could see when a colleague was about to undermine me, so I framed my idea as an extension of theirs, disarming their resistance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to reshape the dynamic. No longer the easy target they expected me to be. Elaine watched me from a distance, her gaze always sharp, her approval never obvious. But one afternoon, after a tense strategy session where I had managed to hold my ground without being cut off, she approached me. "Better," she said simply. That was all. But from Elaine, that single word carried the weight of a promotion. It meant I was learning. It meant I was no longer invisible. Weeks later, she came to me with a challenge that made my stomach twist with equal parts fear and excitement. "There's a new project," she said. "High stakes, high visibility. They'll throw you into it expecting you to drown. I want you to take it." I stared at her, unsure if she was serious. "Why me?" I asked. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Because you're ready to stop playing defense. And because if you don't take this, they'll keep you small forever." Her words lit a fire in me I couldn't ignore. I said yes, even though my hands trembled when I signed on to the assignment. The project was ambitious, launching a new executives who seemed more interested in watching me sweat than in the actual data. I made mistakes, small ones, and each time Richard was there, circling, waiting for blood. But I documented everything, prepared relentlessly, and leaned into my empathy to read the room, to sense when tension needed softening or when confidence needed hardening. For the first time, I felt not like prey, but like someone learning to navigate the currents with intention. The night before the launch, I barely slept. My apartment floor was covered in notes, charts, color-coded timelines. I paced back and forth, rehearsing my talking points until my throat burned. My heart raced, not just with fear of failure, but with the intoxicating possibility of proving them wrong. I thought about the laughter in that boardroom months ago, the way they had written me off as too sensitive. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of them with results they couldn't ignore. Tomorrow, I would take back a piece of the voice Richard had stolen from me. The launch day arrived with the electric hum of anticipation. The conference hall buzzed with executives, partners, clients, each one a witness to what would either be my triumph or my undoing. I wore my sharpest suit, not to impress, but to armor myself. As I stepped onto the stage, my palms slick with sweat, I locked eyes with Elaine at the back of the room. She gave the faintest nod, and for the first time, I believed I belonged there. I began presenting, my voice steady, my slides crisp, my strategy clear. The room leaned in. For once, no one interrupted. And then it happened. Midway through the presentation, as I unveiled the data analysis that formed the backbone of our campaign, the screen flickered. Numbers shifted, graphs warped. My stomach dropped. The data no longer aligned with my research. It showed errors, discrepancies, contradictions that painted me as careless, or worse, dishonest. A murmur rippled through the audience. Richard's smirk was immediate, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Looks like someone didn't check their numbers," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Heat flooded my face, my throat tightened, and every ounce of composure I had built threatened to collapse.
I knew I had checked those numbers 100 times. I knew the data was solid. This wasn't a mistake. This was sabotage. But as the whispers spread and the executives' faces hardened,
Fingers. The data flashing on the screen was not my work. The numbers were wrong, the charts were distorted, and the narrative was shattered beyond recognition. Yet to everyone watching, it looked like incompetence. To them, it looked like I had built my entire case on sand. I saw it in their faces, the tightening jaws, the shaking heads, the subtle exchange of glances that carried a single verdict. She failed. The meeting ended in a haze of embarrassment. Executives shuffled out with forced smiles, murmuring to each other in tones low enough for me not to hear, but pointed enough that I understood. Richard lingered just long enough to whisper, "Tough break, but maybe this was too much for you," before walking away with that smug satisfaction plastered across his face. I stood frozen in that conference hall, the silence ringing louder than the earlier applause. I wanted to scream, to drag them all back in and force them to see the truth. But all I could do was pack my laptop, swallow the humiliation, and walk out with my head held higher than I felt. If I bowed now, it would be the end. By the time I reached my desk, the whispers had already begun. The office is a cruel ecosystem. It feeds on scandal, thrives on weakness, and magnifies failure until it becomes identity. As I passed clusters of colleagues, I caught fragments of their hushed conversations. She looked so lost up there. Imagine screwing up numbers that badly. Guess Richard was right about her. Their voices pierced me more than I wanted to admit, but I kept walking, my face a mask of calm even as my insides burned with rage. My reputation, fragile as glass, had shattered in a single afternoon, and now I was standing barefoot on its shards. Over the next few days, the ridicule spread like wildfire. My inbox, once filled with polite requests, now dripped with condescension. "Double-check this just in case," one email read. Another ended with, "We wouldn't want another incident." Laughter followed me into the break room. Silences fell whenever I entered a conversation, and every glance felt like an accusation. I became the cautionary tale, the example whispered to new hires. Don't be like her. The worst part was Weapon, and weapons could be turned back on those who wielded them. I began retracing every step of my work. Late at night, after the office emptied and the city outside pulsed with neon, and I sat alone under the flicker of fluorescent lights, combing through files. I compared original drafts, checked timestamps, and cross-referenced datasets. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, buried deep in the audit trail, I found discrepancies. Files that had been opened when I wasn't logged in. Edits made under my credentials at hours when I was nowhere near the office. Numbers adjusted, just enough to skew the narrative, just enough to collapse the strategy in real time. My stomach dropped as the truth crystallized. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Someone wanted me to fail, and they wanted the failure to be spectacular. I printed the logs, tucked them into my journal, and stared at the evidence until my eyes blurred with exhaustion. The realization was both vindicating and horrifying. Vindicating because I knew I hadn't been incompetent. Horrifying because this meant someone powerful had set me up. And if they had access to manipulate files under my name, they had resources far beyond mine. This wasn't just office bullying anymore. This was warfare. The next morning, I carried myself through the office with forced composure. Richard greeted me with mock sympathy, clapping me on the shoulder in front of others and saying, "Tough lessons make better professionals." I forced a smile, but inside I seethed. I wanted to scream at him, to accuse him right there in front of everyone. But I didn't. Not yet. I was learning that timing was everything. Predators struck when prey exposed their throats. If I revealed what I knew too soon, I'd be silenced before I could fight back. So I waited, watched, and documented. Every smirk, every word, every pattern of behavior went into my growing archive of evidence. They thought they had broken me, but what they didn't realize was that they were forging me instead. Still, the isolation weighed heavy. At night, the walls of my apartment closed in on me.
my thoughts looping endlessly. What if I was wrong? What if I was chasing shadows, building conspiracy theories to mask
Who had been in this game for decades? The question haunted me, but it also sharpened my resolve. If they saw me as a threat worth destroying, then maybe, just maybe, I was stronger than I realized. Days blurred into weeks, and I carried on with quiet defiance. I kept my head down in meetings, but my ears open. I played the role of the chastened employee, while behind the mask, I built my arsenal. Every shred of evidence I found, I secured. Every inconsistency, I recorded. I didn't know when or how I would use it, but I knew one day the opportunity would come, and when it did, I would be ready. Then, one night, as I sat hunched over my laptop with only the glow of the screen lighting my apartment, an email arrived. No subject line. No sender I recognized. Just a single sentence glowing in the inbox like a threat carved into stone. If you want to survive, stop asking questions. That email should have terrified me. Instead, it woke me up. The words burned into my screen like a warning flare in the dark. For a long moment, I just stared at them, waiting for my pulse to slow, but it didn't. My body shook, not from fear, but from something deeper, sharper. Rage. Whoever sent that email thought they could intimidate me into silence, thought they could scare me into shrinking back into the corner they'd built for me. But the message didn't break me. It lit a fire. If anything, it confirmed what I already suspected. I was closer to the truth than they wanted me to be, close enough that they had to threaten me. That meant I was dangerous to them, and that realization changed everything. I shut my laptop, sat back in the quiet hum of my apartment, and made a decision I knew I couldn't undo. I would not stop asking questions. I would not let them bury me alive. If this was a game of survival, then I was done playing prey. From that moment forward, I wasn't just an employee trying to fit in. I was an investigator working from the inside, and I was going to uncover exactly who was pulling the strings. The next morning, I walked into the office with my head high, even though my chest ached with nerves. I forced a calm smile onto my face, rehearsed enough that it almost felt real. If anyone was watching me closely, What they had seen. At first, they looked at me with suspicion, like they couldn't decide whether I was naive or reckless. But empathy has its own kind of gravity, and slowly they began to open up. And what I heard confirmed my worst fears. There were patterns, quiet, hidden, but undeniable. Budgets adjusted at the last minute with no explanation. Reports signed off with signatures that looked too perfect to be real. Vendors approved that no one had ever heard of, their addresses little more than empty offices or P.O. boxes. And threaded through it all was the same warning. Don't ask questions. People had learned to keep their heads down, to look the other way. But not everyone could ignore what they saw. A junior analyst, nervous and pale, told me he had noticed entire rows of data being changed overnight, the trail wiped clean by morning. "It's like ghosts work here," he whispered, glancing around as if someone might hear. Another assistant admitted that she'd once tried to flag a discrepancy in expense reports and was shut down so harshly she cried in the bathroom for an hour. "You don't understand," "It's bigger than Richard. It's the whole system." The more I heard, the more the puzzle came together. This wasn't just about me being humiliated in a meeting or Richard stealing my work. This was corruption, systemic, deliberate, and dangerous. People were cooking numbers, falsifying data, and covering it with layers of silence so thick that anyone who questioned it was crushed. And I had stumbled right into the middle of it. My so-called sensitivity, the thing they mocked, had become my advantage, because I saw what others ignored. I heard what they refused to listen to, and I felt the fear that kept them quiet, but I refused to let it own me. Still, the deeper I dug, the heavier the weight became. At night, in my apartment, I spread my notes across the table, my journal overflowing with fragments of whispered conversations, inconsistencies in reports, names of people who seemed too clean to be trusted. I saw the outlines of something massive, something that went beyond Richard's petty cruelty. And with every new discovery came the same question.
What was I going to do about it? Exposing it could destroy me. Staying silent would destroy me in another way. I was standing at the edge of
myself. They'd bury me alive. She believed I could survive this, and that belief, faint as it was enough to keep me standing. One evening, after another long day of careful observation, I stayed behind in the office. The floor was empty, the hum of the HVAC system the only sound. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I dug deeper into the archived reports, searching for the faintest cracks in their facade. And then I saw it. A quarterly report filed under my department, signed with my credentials, attached to my name. My blood ran cold as I opened it. The numbers were off, wildly off, projecting profits that didn't exist, approving expenses that had never been made, and at the bottom, in bold, was my digital signature. It was as if I had been the one to falsify the report. It was as if I had committed fraud. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. My first instinct was denial. This couldn't be real. But the file was there, time-stamped, logged, and authenticated as mine. Someone had gone beyond sabotaging a presentation. Someone had planted me at the center of a crime. And I knew instantly what it meant. They weren't just trying to humiliate me anymore. They were trying to destroy me. My name was now tied to fraud, and if I didn't find a way to fight back, I wasn't just going to lose my career. I was going to lose everything. When your name becomes the weapon, survival turns into war. The first time I saw my name attached to that falsified report, my mind went blank. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. It felt like my chest had been crushed beneath an invisible weight. The letters of my name glowed on the screen, bold and undeniable, branding me as the author of numbers I had never touched, approvals I had never given. It was one thing to be mocked as too sensitive, to be sabotaged in a meeting, to be underestimated. But this was different. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was about destruction. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to push me out. They were building a case to bury me. Panic surged through me in waves. My career, already fragile, was now hanging by a thread. But more than my career, there was something darker clawing at the edges of my thoughts. What if this went beyond reputation?
My feet. I couldn't stay still. My thoughts ricocheted between extremes. Should I quit and run before it got worse, or should I stand and fight even if it meant losing everything? Fear screamed at me to walk away, but something deeper whispered that walking away would be the same as admitting guilt, and guilt was the one thing I refused to carry. The next morning, I went straight to Richard's office. I didn't wait for permission to enter. I pushed the door open, startling him as he scrolled lazily through his phone. He looked up with that infuriating smirk and said, "Well, if it isn't our numbers girl, what's the crisis today?" I dropped the report on his desk, the papers slapping against the polished wood. "This," I said, my voice sharper than I expected. "This has my name on it, and I didn't write it." He leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing with calculated amusement. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" "I'm not accusing. I'm telling you. Someone falsified this report and used my credentials." Richard gave a long, theatrical sigh, shaking his head as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "Do you hear yourself? Fraud, conspiracies? Maybe you should take a vacation. Stress does strange things to people, makes them imagine shadows where there are none." His words hit like poison, gaslighting again, twisting my reality, painting me as paranoid. But this time, I didn't shrink. "I know what I saw," I said firmly, "and if you think I'll take the fall for this, you're wrong." The smile faded from his lips for just a second, and in that flicker, I saw something cold, something dangerous. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual condescension. "Careful," he said softly, almost a whisper. "Words like that can end careers. Yours, specifically." I left his office shaking, but beneath the fear was a flicker of something else. Clarity. Richard wasn't denying because he was innocent. He was denying because he was confident he could get away with it. He thought the system would protect him, not me. And maybe he was right, but I couldn't let that stop me. If I didn't fight back, if I didn't build proof strong enough to pierce through their lies, I was finished. That night, I went to the one person I trusted, Elaine. I told her everything. The email, the whispers, the sabotaged data, the falsified report. You release it where it hurts them most. Her words were a lifeline, but also a weight. Gathering proof meant playing a long game, living under suspicion, walking on a knife's edge every single day. It meant pretending I didn't know, pretending I wasn't building a case in the shadows. But what choice did I have? So I began. Every night after work, I compiled evidence. I collected audit trails, emails, discrepancies in financial reports. I made copies on encrypted drives, stored backups in places no one would think to look. My journal became more than therapy. It became a blueprint of corruption, a roadmap of how they were manipulating numbers and covering their tracks. The more I dug, the more horrifying the picture became. Fake vendors, inflated profits, expenses funneled into shell accounts. It wasn't just about me, it was about millions of dollars. Entire livelihoods twisted for the gain of a few. But the more evidence I gathered, the more paranoid I became. I felt eyes on me in the hallways, footsteps behind me on my walk home. Once, late at night in the office, I swore I saw someone watching me from the glass conference room, their silhouette gone when I looked again. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was being tapped. Every locked door felt less secure than the night before. And yet, I couldn't stop. Because every new file, every new inconsistency was another brick in the fortress I was building around myself. Proof was my only protection now. Still, fear clawed at me. I thought about my future, about the possibility that no matter how hard I fought, they might win, that the narrative would be twisted until I was nothing more than the girl who cried, the girl who failed, the girl who committed fraud. I thought about my mother's words, my friends telling me to quit, Richard's smirk. But then I thought about Elaine, about the way she stood tall in rooms full of men who wanted her silenced, about the way she believed I could survive this. And each time I thought of her, I found just enough strength to keep going. Then it happened. One morning, as I settled into my desk, a thick envelope waited for me. My name framed as criminal. And as the rumors spread across the office, I could feel the air change. People who once smirked behind my back now avoided me entirely, as if guilt were contagious. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Eyes followed me like I was an exhibit in a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you're careless. This is what happens when you think you belong. The shame pressed down heavier than anything I had ever felt. I imagined my reputation bleeding out in real time, staining every hallway I walked through. And worse than the whispers at work was the fear of what came next. If my name was listed in an investigation, then it wasn't just colleagues who would question me. It was the entire industry. Blacklisting. That word haunted me. Once marked, I'd never work in business again. No company would risk hiring the girl tied to fraud. The thought hollowed me out until even breathing felt like labor. When my family heard the news, the questions came like bullets. My mother's voice cracked over the phone, the weight of disappointment sharper than anger. How could this happen, Esha? I told you this world would eat you alive. My brother was harsher. You should quit before you drag the family name down with you. Their words, meant as concern, carved into me like knives. It wasn't just my future at stake anymore. It was theirs too. And for a moment, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I should walk away, escape before the quicksand swallowed me whole. For days, I toyed with the thought of quitting. I drafted resignation letters in the dead of night, imagining the relief of no longer walking into an office where I was branded guilty. I pictured myself disappearing, starting over somewhere quiet, somewhere anonymous, far from the cutthroat world that had chewed me up. The fantasy of leaving pulled at me like a siren song. And yet, every time I hovered over the send button on that draft email, something in me refused. Because quitting now would mean they won. Quitting now would mean accepting a guilt I didn't carry. And beneath the crushing shame, a small ember of defiance still burned. That ember flared when I started looking beyond the polished offices and pristine reports to the people whose lives were touched by our work, the customers, the employees on the ground, the communities relying on promises that were counted profits, those people were left carrying the cost. It struck me with brutal clarity. If I walked away, it wouldn't just be my career that died. It would be their chance at justice. If I stayed silent, I would become complicit in the harm I had sworn I wanted to prevent. My so-called sensitivity, the very thing they mocked, wouldn't let me forget their faces. Empathy anchored me to a truth larger than my fear. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone being crushed under a system that thrived on silence. So I made a choice. I wouldn't quit. I wouldn't run. If they wanted to paint me as the villain, I would show them who the real villains were. I would expose the truth, even if it cost me everything. And to do that, I needed more than my journal and scattered notes. I needed proof that couldn't be denied, evidence strong enough to cut through their lies and outlast their gaslighting, proof that would stand in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The idea came to me in the middle of a sleepless night, my resignation draft still glowing on the screen. If the system inside was rigged against me, then I would take it outside. I would leak the documents, deliver the evidence to someone they couldn't control. Journalists, regulators, anyone willing to see past the smokescreen. It was a reckless plan, dangerous and almost certainly career-ending. But at least it would put the truth into the world. At least it would mean they couldn't bury me without exposing themselves in the process. The next day, I began assembling everything. I copied files onto encrypted drives, organized my notes into timelines, highlighted connections between falsified reports and executive approvals. Every page was another weapon in my arsenal, another piece of a puzzle that, once revealed, would show just how deep the corruption ran. I worked in silence, my expression carefully blank, so no one could guess what I was building behind the facade. Every glance over my shoulder, every sound in the hallway, sent a jolt of fear through me, but I kept going. At night I rehearsed the steps in my head. Who would I contact first? Which documents would I release?
We know what you're doing. The cursor blinked beneath the words like a heartbeat, mocking me in the silence of my apartment. Someone had discovered my plan to leak the documents, and now I wasn't just cornered, I was exposed. In business, betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people smiling beside you. The email that appeared on my screen in the middle of the night haunted me long after I closed my laptop. We know what you're doing. Just 5 words, but they carried the weight of a noose tightening around my neck. I sat frozen in my apartment, every shadow suddenly hostile, every sound outside my window a threat. My pulse hammered in my ears. Someone was watching. Someone had seen my plan to leak the evidence, and now they wanted me to know that I was exposed. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts raced in circles. Who had sent the email? How much did they know? Was I being followed? Was my apartment bugged? By morning, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin, but the fear had hardened into something else. Anger. They thought they could intimidate me into silence, but if anything, their warning had confirmed I was closer to the truth than I realized. Fear would not silence me. I would find another way to fight back. So I reached out. I knew I couldn't keep everything bottled inside the walls of the company anymore. If the system inside was corrupt, then I needed help from the outside. I thought of a journalist I had admired for years, someone whose articles had toppled entire corporations, who had exposed corruption so deep it sparked congressional hearings. Her reputation was solid, her work respected, and if anyone could bring the truth to light, it was her. I spent hours drafting my email, rewriting it over and over, trying to balance urgency with caution. I couldn't reveal everything. If the company intercepted it, I'd be finished. But I needed to show enough to catch her attention. My fingers shook as I hit send, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Hours turned into days before her reply finally came.
Let's talk. Off the record. For now. The meeting was arranged at a cafe far from downtown, the kind of place where businessmen rarely ventured. I arrived early, sitting near.
Lips tightened, and I thought, she sees it. She knows this is real. But then, almost as quickly, her expression shifted. She closed the folder carefully, too carefully, and leaned forward. "This is big," she said. "Too big. I'll need time." "Of course," I whispered. "Whatever it takes." She stood, tucking the folder under her arm, and walked away with a tight smile. I sat in the cafe long after she left, clutching my cup until it went cold, imagining the story she would write, the truth she would uncover, the justice that finally felt within reach. But days passed, then a week. No article appeared. No calls came. My cautious follow-up emails went unanswered. When I finally dialed her office, her assistant answered with a practiced indifference. "She's not pursuing this story." The words gutted me. Betrayal tastes different when it comes wrapped in silence. I had handed her everything, risked everything to trust her, and now she was gone, vanished into the shadows of self-preservation. Maybe she had been bribed. Maybe she had been threatened. Or maybe she had simply decided that protecting her career was more important than exposing the truth of mine. Whatever the reason, my lifeline had snapped. I turned back to Elaine, the one person inside who had guided me when no one else did. But when I sought her out in the hallway, she didn't meet my eyes. "Not now," she said quickly, brushing past me. At first, I told myself she was busy, preoccupied, but the pattern repeated. Each time I tried to speak with her, she grew colder, more distant. Finally, when I cornered her in her office, desperate for answers, she shut the door and said quietly, "You need to be careful. The more noise you make, the more dangerous this becomes. For both of us. For both of us." Her words were a knife. Elaine, who had once whispered truth into my ear when I felt invisible, was now stepping away to protect herself, and I couldn't even blame her. She had climbed this mountain long before me, survived battles I couldn't imagine. Why should she risk everything for someone like me? Still, the sting of her distance cut deeper than any insult Richard had thrown. Losing her felt like losing my anchor, and so the isolation grew. At work, I was treated like a contagion. Conversations hushed Mattered. What if Richard was right? What if I wasn't cut out for this world? What if all I was doing was dragging myself closer to ruin? But even in the loneliness, even in the doubt, there was something I couldn't silence. The truth itself, the evidence I had gathered, the patterns I had traced, the corruption I had uncovered. It sat heavy in my files, undeniable and damning. If I gave up, that truth would die with me, and I couldn't let that happen. I kept going, even as the walls closed in tighter. I worked late, copying files to encrypted drives, documenting every inconsistency. Each night, I rehearsed my plan to release everything, waiting for the right opening. If no one would help me, then I would go alone. And then, just as the weight of isolation threatened to crush me, something shifted. It was late, the office nearly empty, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I sat hunched over my desk, my eyes burning from hours of combing through doctored spreadsheets, when I felt someone at my side. I looked up, startled, to see a young colleague, Ethan, a junior analyst barely a year into the job. I had barely noticed him before, one of the countless faces swallowed by the grind. He glanced around nervously, then leaned close and whispered, "I know what they're doing, and I can prove it." I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. In his hand was a flash drive, small and ordinary, yet in that moment it glowed like salvation. He looked terrified, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been using your name, but I've seen the logs. I've been tracking it. I didn't know who to trust, but I think it has to be you." I stared at the flash drive, my breath caught between hope and suspicion. For weeks I had been betrayed, abandoned, left to fight alone. And now, here was a hand extended in the darkness, offering proof that could save me or destroy me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't alone. But could I trust him? Or was this just another trap waiting to snap shut around me? For the first time, Someone was willing to risk everything with me. When Ethan slid that flash drive into my hand, I felt the weight of it sink into my palm like a live grenade. For weeks, I had been wandering through shadows alone. The files opened, his voice steadied. "I've been tracking the edits," he explained, scrolling through pages of metadata and access logs. At first, I thought it was just sloppy auditing, but then I noticed a pattern. The same accounts, the same signatures, popping up in reports they shouldn't have touched. They're using your login, but the access trails connect to terminals in the executive wing. I leaned closer, my heart hammering as the truth unfolded. He wasn't exaggerating. The timestamps lined up with late-night edits I hadn't made, signatures attached to approvals I hadn't given. And more than that, the same accounts appeared again and again, names tied not to low-level employees, but to people far higher up the ladder. "This isn't just Richard," I whispered, my stomach twisting. "This goes deeper." We spent hours combing through the files, building a timeline that stretched back months, even years. Patterns emerged, ugly and undeniable. Reports inflated just before board meetings. Expenses funneled through vendors that didn't exist. Profits conjured out of thin air to appease investors. And at the center of it all were names I never expected to see. Directors, senior executives, even a board member or two. The corruption wasn't an isolated act of sabotage against me. It was systemic, orchestrated from the very top. I had been targeted because I stumbled too close to their machinery, and they needed a scapegoat to protect themselves. As the scope widened, so did the stakes. We weren't just talking about office politics or bruised reputations anymore. This was fraud at a scale that could collapse the company if revealed. Billions of dollars tied to lies, entire markets manipulated, investors misled. The weight of it pressed down on me until I felt like I couldn't breathe. But alongside the fear was something else, a growing sense of vindication. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I had been right all along. And now, I wasn't alone in knowing it. Ethan worked with a quiet intensity that humbled me. For someone so young, he carried himself with the gravity of someone who understood the danger. "They think people like us won't notice," he said once, almost bitterly. "That we'll keep our heads down, crunch the numbers, and never question why things don't add up." But I couldn't ignore it anymore. His voice cracked slightly, and I realized then that this wasn't just about me. He had his own reasons to shake the walls of power. But with every new discovery, the risk grew sharper. The closer we got to the truth, the more paranoid I became. Once, as we left the office late, I noticed a black car idling across the street, headlights off, engine humming softly. It was still there when I returned the next morning. Another time, Ethan swore someone had followed him from the subway, a man in a dark coat who disappeared the moment he turned to confront him. Whether it was real surveillance or just the paranoia eating at us, we couldn't tell. But either way, the message was clear. Someone knew we were digging. Inside the office, the tension was palpable. Richard's smirk seemed sharper, his barbs more deliberate, as if he sensed I was plotting something he couldn't quite name. Elaine avoided me altogether, her silence heavier than words. And colleagues whispered less now, not because the gossip had faded, but because they were afraid. Afraid of being seen talking to me, afraid of being dragged into whatever storm was building around me. Isolation still clung to me, but now it was different. I wasn't isolated because I was weak, I was isolated because I was dangerous. And yet, through all of it, Ethan stayed. He could have walked away at any time. He could have handed me the flash drive and washed his hands of the mess. But night after night he returned, laptop under his arm, determination etched into his young face. It struck me how much he was risking. He had no power, no seniority, no protection. If they discovered his role, they wouldn't just punish him, they would crush him. And still, he chose to stand beside me. His loyalty reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. Leadership isn't about titles or corner offices. It's about earning the kind of trust that makes people willing to risk everything for you. Weeks into our secret alliance, the picture was undeniable. The corruption tied directly to board members, to investors who had everything to gain from inflated numbers and everything to lose from the truth. The fraud wasn't just a stain on the company. It was a cancer spreading through its core. And if we revealed it, the fallout would be catastrophic. But if we stayed silent, we would be complicit in letting it continue. The choice was no longer about survival. It was about justice. I remember one night, sitting across from Ethan, the weight of it all pressing down on us. If we go to my desk when I heard the commotion. Voices raised, the thud of heavy footsteps. I turned just in time to see security flanking Ethan, his face pale but defiant as they escorted him toward the elevators. His desk had already been cleared, a cardboard box in his arms. "Violation of company policy," one of the managers announced to no one in particular, his voice loud enough to echo across the floor. "He's been terminated, effective immediately." My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand answers. But my voice caught in my throat as Ethan glanced back at me, eyes burning with a silent message I couldn't decipher. And then he was gone, swallowed by the elevator doors. My only ally had been ripped away in broad daylight, and I didn't know if he had left me the evidence I needed, or if the last proof of the truth had just been taken with him. When they want to silence you, they start by making you paranoid. The image of Ethan being marched out of the office by security replayed in my head like a broken film reel. His pale face, the cardboard box clutched in his hands, the silent message in his eyes. All of it haunted me. He had risked everything to stand beside me, and now he was gone, erased in a matter of minutes. I didn't know whether he had left me the final piece of evidence we needed, or whether the company had confiscated everything. All I knew was that I was alone again, and more exposed than ever. It didn't take long for the paranoia to set in. My phone began to feel heavier in my pocket, its buzz sharper, as though every vibration carried someone else's eyes. I started noticing tiny lags when I typed, subtle echoes on my calls, the faintest static on the line when I spoke to my family. My emails, once filled with routine chatter, suddenly glitched, attachments missing, drafts disappearing. At first, I told myself it was exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew. They were watching me. They were listening. My life was no longer mine. The surveillance wasn't just digital. It was physical, too. A man in a dark coat appeared near my apartment building more than once, standing just out of reach of the streetlight glow. When I turned to look, he shifted away, his face hidden in the shadows. At work, I felt eyes on me constantly, even when the office seemed empty. And gauge their truth. The world had dragged me into a spy novel, and if I didn't adapt, I would be the casualty no one remembered. The shift wasn't easy. Living in constant suspicion eats away at your sanity. I jumped at every sound in my apartment, checked locks 3 times before sleeping, and even then, sleep rarely came. But with every adjustment, I felt myself hardening. Fear was no longer just fear, it was training. Every glance over my shoulder sharpened my instincts. Every paranoid thought prepared me for the moment when the attack would no longer be silent, but direct. And I knew that moment was coming. It came in the form of an email, this one legitimate, stamped with the company's crest and signed by an executive assistant whose politeness made the venom sting sharper. "You are scheduled to present at the upcoming investor board meeting on behalf of your department." My chest tightened as I read the words again and again. I was being pulled into the lion's den. Investor board meetings weren't routine updates. They were the stage on which the company justified its existence, the theater where billions of dollars shifted hands. It was where lies were polished until they gleamed like truth. And now, they wanted me to stand at the front of that stage. I knew instantly what it meant. This wasn't a promotion. It wasn't recognition. It was strategy. They wanted me front and center, the face of the department, so that if the fraud unraveled, the blame would land squarely on me. Richard's smirk flashed in my mind, his voice echoing, "Careful. Words like that can end careers." This was his masterpiece. Put me in the spotlight, hand me the script of lies, and let me hang myself with their rope. For days, I wrestled with the weight of it. Should I refuse? Should I walk away? But refusal wasn't an option. They would frame it as guilt, as weakness, and I would be destroyed anyway. If I agreed, I risked becoming the mouthpiece of their deception. The choice was no choice at all. I would have to stand before the board, stare into the eyes of men who already suspected nothing, and decide whether to play their game, or burn it down from the inside. I prepared like I had never prepared before.
My notebooks filled with strategies, contingencies, phrases designed to sound,
"You are not crazy. You are not weak. You are not theirs to break." And slowly, painfully, I built the armor I would need to survive that stage. The morning of the board meeting, the city gleamed cold and indifferent, skyscrapers rising like sentinels against the gray sky. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a suit that wasn't flashy but carried quiet authority. In the mirror, I saw not the girl who once cried in a hallway, not the intern mocked for being too sensitive, but a woman forged in fire, tempered by betrayal, sharpened by survival. For the first time, I almost believed I belonged here. The boardroom was larger than any I had seen, a cathedral of glass and steel where power hummed in every polished surface. The board members sat in a semicircle, their expressions carved from stone, their eyes calculating. Behind them loomed the investors, men and women who controlled more wealth than entire countries, their patience as thin as their smiles. Richard was there too, leaning back in his chair, that familiar smirk tugging at his lips as if he were already savoring my downfall. I walked to the podium, my footsteps steady even as my heart threatened to break free from my chest. I placed my notes on the surface, lifted my eyes, and began. The words flowed, polished, rehearsed, carefully constructed lies, designed to paint the company as thriving, ethical, unstoppable. I spoke them with precision, my voice calm, my tone confident. And as I spoke, I watched their faces, reading every flicker of doubt, every spark of belief, every shadow of suspicion. But then, as the presentation deepened, I realized something chilling. The slides, the reports, the data. They weren't just exaggerated. They were blatant fabrications. Numbers I had never seen before appeared on the screen. Statistics pulled from thin air. Projections that defied logic. It wasn't just spin. It was fraud, laid out in bold colors and bullet points. And I was the one standing in front of it, presenting as if it were gospel truth. My throat tightened. My hands trembled. But I forced myself to keep speaking, to keep the mask in place. Because the realization struck me with brutal clarity. This wasn't just about making me look competent. This was about making me the face of their deception. What thought fear would keep me compliant. They thought I would tremble under the weight of the spotlight. But they had forgotten something critical. Fear had already burned through me, hollowed me out, and left something sharper in its place. Rage, defiance, and a determination that if I was going down, I would take them with me. That night in my apartment, I rebuilt the presentation slide by slide. I kept the polished lies they handed me, but I wove in my own thread of truth, breadcrumbs that no one would notice at first, but that would gnaw at the edges of the story. Subtle inconsistencies, numbers that, if examined closely, contradicted one another. Questions disguised as clarifications. My plan wasn't to blow everything wide open immediately. It was to plant doubt in the minds of the investors, the kind of doubt that would grow into suspicion, and suspicion into investigation. If I could make them look closely enough, the company's own lies would betray them. As I worked, Ethan's face haunted me. I imagined him sitting across from me, urging me not to let his sacrifice be wasted. His abrupt firing had been a warning. They were willing to erase anyone who stood in their way. But if they wanted me silenced, they had made a mistake by giving me a stage. They had handed me a microphone in front of the only people they truly feared losing, the investors, and I intended to use it. The morning of the board meeting, I walked into the building with my armor on. Not literal armor, but the kind forged from resolve. My suit was immaculate, my hair tied back with precision, my expression calm and unreadable. Inside, my chest felt like it carried a storm, but I had learned how to hide it. My footsteps echoed through the marble lobby as if daring anyone to question whether I belonged. The intimidation began before I even reached the boardroom. Richard intercepted me in the hallway, his smile razor sharp. "Nervous?" he asked, his voice dripping with false camaraderie. "Don't worry, just stick to the script."
Investors don't like surprises. His eyes locked onto mine, a silent threat beneath the veneer of encouragement. Minutes later, another executive cornered me near the elevators, his knives. Behind them, the investors loomed, a gallery of power whose decisions could shift markets with a single word. At the head of the table sat the CEO, his presence commanding, his smile thin as glass. I walked to the podium, my notes clutched in steady hands. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to disappear before the walls closed in completely. But I forced my spine straight, lifted my chin, and let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it. When I spoke, my voice was steady, stronger than I felt inside. The presentation began smoothly, a careful performance of confidence. I delivered the polished numbers, the glowing projections, the scripted reassurances that painted the company as unstoppable. But beneath the veneer, I layered my breadcrumbs. A reference to a vendor that didn't exist. A projection that contradicted a previous slide. A question phrased as an observation. Of course, this figure assumes the expenses remain as recorded, though, as we all know, expenses are sometimes fluid. I watched their faces as I spoke. Most nodded, absorbing the surface message, but a few frowned, their pens pausing mid-note, their brows tightening in suspicion. I pressed on, careful not to push too hard too soon. It was a delicate dance. Speak the lies convincingly enough to avoid immediate backlash, but lace them with just enough truth to spark unease. Halfway through, Richard caught my eye from across the table. His smirk was gone. In its place was something sharper, a flicker of recognition that I wasn't playing the role he'd scripted for me. He shifted in his seat, whispering something to the executive beside him. I felt their eyes boring into me, searching for cracks. But I didn't falter. My voice carried steady, my gestures precise, every word deliberate. The closer I came to the end, the heavier the tension grew. The investors were listening more closely now, their expressions no longer detached, but engaged, calculating. I could feel the questions building in their minds, the doubts seeping through the polished facade. For the first time, I saw the executives squirm, and in that moment, I knew my plan was working. But just as I reached the final segment, the moment when the most damning breadcrumb would drop, it happened. The CEO, who had sat silent throughout, suddenly rose from his seat. His chair scraped against the floor with a screech that echoed through that was supposed to expose them had turned on me. And the man with the most power in the room had just branded me a liar. For years, I stayed quiet, but not today. The CEO's words hit me like a gunshot. She's lying. The room erupted in murmurs, investors shifting in their seats, board members exchanging sharp glances. In an instant, the careful balance I had built with my breadcrumbs of truth tilted dangerously toward collapse. My throat went dry. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might break through my chest. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to disappear, to melt into the polished floor and let the storm pass over me. But then something inside me snapped. I had been silenced, mocked, and scapegoated for too long. If I backed down now, they wouldn't just win. They would bury me alive. And I refused to be buried. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, forcing my voice into the calm that years of humiliation had taught me to master. With respect, I said, my eyes locking on the CEO's. I am not lying. But if you believe otherwise, then let's look at the numbers together. The boardroom fell silent. Investors leaned forward, curiosity sparking in their eyes. The CEO stiffened, his smile faltering for the first time. He hadn't expected me to fight back. Not here, not now, not in front of the people who held the true power. I turned back to the screen and advanced to the next slide. But this wasn't the one they had approved. This was mine. Hidden inside the presentation, tucked where no one had thought to look, was the first piece of undeniable evidence. I highlighted the inflated profit projections and overlaid them with raw expense data, exposing the discrepancy in numbers so stark it couldn't be brushed off as error. Murmurs rippled through the room. One investor raised a brow. Another leaned over to whisper urgently to his colleague. The CEO's face darkened, his jaw tightening. But I wasn't finished. My voice grew stronger, steadier, fueled by months of rage and fear boiling into defiance. For years, these numbers have been manipulated, I said. Not by me, not by anyone in this room who hasn't been given access, but by accounts tied directly to the executive wing. Gasps broke out. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his smirk gone. I flipped to the next slide, revealing audit trails Ethan had uncovered. Metadata showing falsified signatures, edits made under my credentials,
linking fraudulent vendors to accounts tied to board members. My hands no longer shook. My voice no longer wavered. "This isn't just about me," I said. "This is about a culture that rewards deceit and punishes integrity. You can dismiss me. You can try to silence me. But you cannot ignore what's on these screens." The room erupted in chaos. Investors shouted questions, demanding explanations. Board members scrambled through their papers, some red-faced with fury, others pale with fear. The CEO tried to regain control, his voice booming, but his authority crumbled under the weight of evidence too sharp to dull. Richard rose from his seat, pointing at me like a prosecutor. "She's manipulating you. This is all a performance." But his words were drowned out by the growing storm. One investor banged a fist on the table, demanding an independent investigation. Another shouted for immediate access to records. The room had tipped. The scales no longer weighted against me, but swinging wildly into uncertainty. And in the center of it all, I stood steady. For the first time in my career, I wasn't defending myself. I was attacking. Every word I spoke was a strike, every document a blow, every truth a blade cutting through years of deceit. I had been branded too sensitive, too weak, too naive for this world. But sensitivity had allowed me to see what others ignored, to feel what others dismissed, to recognize the rot beneath the surface. And now, that very sensitivity had become my weapon. The fallout was immediate. Security entered the room, summoned by panicked whispers from the board. The CEO protested, his voice a mix of rage and desperation, but the investors had made their decision. His authority shattered in real time as guards stepped to his side, asking him to leave the chamber. Richard shouted in protest, but no one listened. The empire they had built on lies was crumbling before their eyes, and for the first time, they were powerless to stop it. As the guards escorted the CEO toward the door, he leaned close, his breath hot against my ear. His voice dropped to a whisper, low enough that only I could hear. "This isn't over." The words slid into me like ice, chilling me even as the room buzzed with the noise of my victory. For all the chaos, for all the shook, and the empire that had once seemed unshakable collapsed in real time. Justice had come, at least in part. Executives who once walked with untouchable arrogance now shuffled into courtrooms in tailored suits that looked like shackles. Richard's smirk disappeared the moment cameras caught him being questioned by federal agents. Board members were named in indictments. Investors distanced themselves in frantic press releases, and the company's pristine glass tower suddenly looked more like a house of cards left in ashes. And yet, amid the spectacle of justice, my own victory felt hollow. I was cleared, legally, officially, undeniably. My name was scrubbed from the falsified reports, my role in exposing the fraud publicly acknowledged. But being cleared didn't erase the months of humiliation, the scars of betrayal, the sleepless nights haunted by whispers and shadows. It didn't erase the doubt in people's eyes when they looked at me, unsure if I was a hero or a traitor. The truth was complicated, and so was the perception. To some, I was the whistleblower who saved investors billions and prevented further deceit. To others, I was the employee who had nearly toppled an empire, whose actions caused stock prices to plummet and thousands of employees to fear for their jobs. In business, perception is everything, and mine was split down the middle. I was both savior and destroyer, saint and sinner, depending on which headline you chose to believe. Walking into the office in those early weeks was surreal. The same hallways that once echoed with whispers about my weakness now buzzed with gossip about my strength. Some colleagues avoided me entirely, as if my presence reminded them of the fragility of their own security. Others approached me with forced smiles, eager to align themselves with the woman who had faced down the CEO and lived. Every interaction carried the weight of history, every glance a reminder that nothing would ever be normal again. The company itself crumbled piece by piece. Departments were gutted, projects suspended, entire divisions dissolved. Federal investigators swarmed through cubicles, pulling files, questioning employees, dismantling the carefully crafted illusions that had sustained the empire. Motives on cable news, and strangers sent messages calling me both courageous and reckless. The duality of it all was exhausting. Some days I felt proud of what I had done. Other days, I questioned whether exposing the truth had been worth the cost. My career was no longer mine. It was a story people told, a symbol they wielded for their own purposes. What haunted me most was the CEO's whisper, "This isn't over." Even as he faced charges, even as his empire burned, his words clung to me like smoke. I knew men like him didn't simply disappear. They reemerged in shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes, biding their time until the world forgot. And so I lived with one eye on the horizon, waiting for the storm to circle back. Months passed, the trials dragged on. Executives were sentenced, fines imposed, reputations shattered. The company, once a titan, teetered on the brink of extinction. Investors debated whether to salvage it or let it die. Employees fled in droves, some out of fear, others in search of stability the company could no longer offer. The building that once felt like a fortress of ambition now echoed with emptiness, its glass walls reflecting a hollow core. And yet, in the rubble, an odd thing began to happen. People started to look at me differently, not just as the woman who exposed corruption, but as someone who might rebuild from the ashes. My small wins accumulated. A project I led saved a client relationship. A proposal I crafted stabilized a division. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, I began to prove that I wasn't just good at tearing down lies. I was capable of building something true. The irony was almost cruel. For years, they had told me I was too sensitive for business, too emotional to survive in the ruthless world of power and profit. And yet, in the aftermath of destruction, it was precisely that sensitivity, my empathy, my unwillingness to look away from the human cost that made me valuable. Where others saw only numbers, I saw lives. Where others saw only collapse, I saw the possibility of renewal. The whispers shifted. She saved us. She could lead. At first, I dismissed them as gossip, idle speculation from people desperate for hope. But then the conversations grew louder, looked at me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. They were offering me the role of CEO, the position once wielded as a weapon against me, now placed in my hands as a chance to rebuild. I thought of everything it had cost. Ethan's sacrifice, Elaine's silence, my family's doubt, my own near destruction. I thought of the CEO's whisper, promising this wasn't over. And I thought of the employees, the customers, the people who had borne the weight of corruption they didn't create. I hadn't given them my answer yet, but one truth echoed in my mind. If I accepted, I wouldn't just be leading a company. I would be rewriting the rules of an empire built on ashes. They said I was too sensitive for business. That's exactly why I won. The first day I walked into the office as CEO, I could feel the weight of every whisper that had once chased me through these halls. The same corridors where I had been mocked as weak, the same rooms where my voice had been dismissed, now echoed with the steady sound of my footsteps, the footsteps of the woman in charge. There was no triumphal march, no applause waiting to greet me, just silence, heavy and watchful, as employees lifted their eyes from their screens to take in the new reality. I wasn't the CEO they had expected. I wasn't the polished titan of industry, armored in arrogance, who had clawed to the top by stepping on everyone below. I was the woman who had cried in the bathroom, who had been mocked for empathy, who had nearly been buried under the lies of men who thought they were untouchable. And now, I was the one holding the crown. But this crown wasn't gold. It was fire, a burden, a test, a chance to burn down everything rotten and rebuild something real. My first act as CEO was not to announce profits or unveil strategy, but to stand before the entire company, employees crammed into the atrium, investors watching on live stream, and tell the truth. This company was built on lies, I began, my voice steady, and those lies nearly destroyed us. But what destroys can also teach. What burns can also purify. We will not survive by pretending this never happened. So we rebuilt differently. Salaries at the bottom were raised before bonuses at the top. We created open books where financials were accessible to every employee, not hidden behind locked doors. We established ethics committees with real power, not the ornamental ones executives once ignored. For the first time, sensitivity wasn't punished, it was rewarded. Employees who raised concerns were promoted, not sidelined. Those who showed compassion in leadership roles were celebrated, not mocked. Slowly, credibility returned. Customers who had abandoned us began to come back, drawn by the transparency they could finally trust. Investors who had written us off as a lost cause reconsidered, curious whether this strange experiment in ethical capitalism might actually work. And when the profits began to climb, not from lies but from loyalty and innovation, those skeptics had no choice but to pay attention. The company became a billion-dollar empire again, but this time not built on sand. It was built on bedrock. We didn't just regain what was lost, we surpassed it, because people believed in us. They believed not because we told them to, but because we earned it. For me, every victory carried a strange echo. Each milestone reminded me of the path that had led here, the betrayal in the boardroom, the humiliation of being called too sensitive, the fear of seeing my name tied to fraud I hadn't committed. I carried those scars with me, not as wounds, but as proof that transformation doesn't come from avoiding pain, but from surviving it. There were days when I still heard the CEO's whisper in my ear, "This isn't over." And in a way, he was right. The battle against corruption is never over. Temptation always lurks. Power always hungers. But now, I was the one standing guard. And I had learned that the strongest armor wasn't ruthlessness, it was empathy. I often thought of Ethan, the young analyst who had risked everything to help me. His courage had been a spark in the darkest hour. And though he never returned to the company, his legacy lived on. Every defense of my choices, but in proof of them. Looking back, the irony was undeniable. The very thing they had tried to weaponize against me, my sensitivity, was what saved me. It was empathy that made me notice the junior employees no one else listened to. It was compassion that drove me to fight for the customers and workers buried beneath fraud. It was vulnerability that allowed me to connect, to inspire trust, to rebuild. What they had called weakness was, in truth, my greatest strength. And so I leaned into it. I made it my philosophy, my strategy, my weapon. When people asked how I turned ashes into empire, my answer was always the same. I listened. I listened to the voices ignored. I listened to the truths buried. I listened to the pain beneath the profits. And in listening, I built something no lie could topple. Years later, when the company's value soared higher than it had ever been under its corrupt predecessors, journalists still asked the same question. How did you do it? And my answer never changed. They told me I was too sensitive for business. But sensitivity isn't weakness. Sensitivity is awareness. Awareness is power. And power, used with empathy, is unstoppable. Standing at the top of a skyscraper once again, overlooking a city glittering with ambition, I felt no arrogance, no hunger for domination. I felt gratitude. For the pain, for the betrayal, for the fire that had forged me into the leader they never expected. And now, I turn that question to you. What if the very thing they told you to hide is the very thing that could make you unstoppable? If this story shook something inside you, then don't let it end here. Tell me in the comments.
Have you ever been told you were too sensitive to succeed? Smash that like button if you believe empathy is real power, and subscribe because the next chapter might just be the one that changes how you see business forever. Your voice matters here, and I'm listening.